Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Vivek Joshi, your host of the Aftermarket Champions podcast. Today, I have a new guest, Carlos Gomez, who I've known for many years now. And over the last many years that I've got to know Carlos, it's been a pleasure to understand his journey, understand the very different path he took to get to the role when I met him back years ago at Baker Hughes. And more importantly, the journey that took him from that role to where he's today as a VP of Augury Alliance for Baker Hughes. Carlos has been a customer of ours for a few years now, and without further ado, I want to introduce Carlos to you. So, welcome, Carlos, to our podcast today.
Hey, Vivek. Pleasure to have the invitation. Thank you for inviting me.
We've been doing these podcasts just for a few weeks now, and over the last five, six interviews that I've done, I've got to kind of ask a couple of things which I'm going to learn from and I go along. So, one of the first things I want to do is maybe have you give us a little introduction about you, the role you play, the company you work for. And really, what I'm trying to understand is your journey into when we met, when you were the executive director for Services in North America for the Baker Hughes businesses. So, kind of a little bit of the background for that, if you don't mind, a little bit about Carlos, a little bit about Baker Hughes, and
Sure.
that'll help.
Yeah, perfect. Currently, as you mentioned, right, currently running what we call our Strategic Software Augury Alliance. So think about that from the standpoint of a lot of these different companies. So the Baker Hughes is the one I work for today. A lot of these original equipment manufacturers and what we produce, really engineering know-how. But we recognize that sometimes we need to partner, right? Or sometimes we need to joint venture or acquire or build it ourselves, right? And in this particular case, we've partnered with an incredible company called Augury, which really provides a fantastic artificial intelligence and machine learning capability for what we call your general purpose equipment. But the real story is how did we get here? How did we get to this path? Because as you and I both know, Vivek, bit of a different journey in terms of where I started versus where I am. But started my career really in strategy and mergers and acquisitions a long time ago with General Electric, G Capital, which is what it was. But really maneuvered from M&A and then into more of a, let's say, general management role, truly dedicated to aftermarket services. So think about what General Electric did so well in building incredible amounts of OEM backlog, right, of what they would call their long-term service agreements and CSAs built on the backbone of turbo machinery, be that for an aero derivative case, be that for aviation, be that for power generation, right? So all that culminated into applying all that know-how and learning all that aftermarket service capability for the same application of that turbo machinery, just for oil and gas.
hmm And so, if I remember correctly, like you said, you started in M&A and strategy and planning. You're not an engineer, are you, by training?
I'm not. I'm actually a finance and economics background.
Okay, which is a little different from all the folks I've interviewed so far who've been like me, been traditionally an engineer, who've moved into some customer service role or a sales role, and eventually found their way into aftermarket. So, you said you did a bunch of M&A work at Capital first, then you maneuvered your way into the power business. How did you wind up in the aftermarket or services role? I know you said it is important for GE, but it's one thing to be important for GE. It's another thing for Carlos Gomez to get the job in there, right? Especially a senior role. How did that happen?
Yeah, so I'd say so it was actually a bit of if you recall, I mean sometimes and there's these different development programs that General Electric did a great job building. So one of them was called the Accelerated Leadership Program. So this is like a mid-career executive training program that puts you through several years. So I figured M&A is wonderful, M&A is fun, but M&A has a really acute pyramid in terms of, look, if there's chance for growth, if there's a chance to lead one of these businesses, typically from an M&A standpoint, you want to take over one of the ones you acquired. The other way to do it is to say, okay, let's build out some additional capabilities, be that in service, be that in sales, be that in commercial, right? Add to your portfolio of skills and then translate that into more of a general management role. So I used that as a pivot and, really made a decision back in the day between healthcare and oil and gas. And at the time, energy seemed like a great choice. I still believe it is. And use that to maneuver into more of this aftermarket services and now call it, rotating equipment, be that turbo machinery, be that general purpose, to really fine tune the know-how I was bringing from the M&A side, now applied to more of your engineering aftermarket capabilities for our customers.
So today you're the VP of the Augury Alliance on behalf of Baker Hughes, and you're trying to build that business. But when we met, you were the executive director of services for North America, and then you took on a couple of different roles. Uh, what was the if I think of 5 years ago when you and I met, what was the motivating factor for you to think about driving proactive growth? And what was it about the aftermarket service business that the Bentley Nevada division and other divisions were trying to kind of make happen back then? What was a motivating factor, if you may?
Yeah, you know what? Yeah, I think it really comes down to one particular experience where in that leadership program that I mentioned, I spent a year between Houston and the Bay Area, really helping General Electric develop its go-to-market commercialization for what it wanted to do with the Predix capability that it was
Mm.
building, right? So call it your, enterprise AI and machine learning platform for our oil and gas customers and our oil and gas applications. What became very clear to us as we were building that out and building that strategy, right? Similar to what IBM was doing at the time and other big companies, right? Was how do we make sure that as time continues, we've got this great backlog and service model of CSA and LTSA calories that are going to come for the next 20 to 5 to 30 years. However, we did know at that time, call this the early 2010s, right? We did know very clearly our customers were desiring to gravitate away from a more traditional service complex to one that would be enabled by a digital capability.
Hmm.
How can we do more with less people? How can we do more and more? Forget preventative, right? How do we move to predictive? How do we move to prescriptive? Again,
Hmm.
far away back in 2010 to where we
Right.
are today, but all that led to a desire and a view that the market was eventually going to gravitate into more of a full-blown digital service model. These two things had to come together, right? The traditional service tied to the ability to deliver real artificial intelligence insights that will allow a customer to do their job more easily. So that's kind of where the bedrock and the foundation of this idea came from. And I just put more and more time into that over it as moving into what a business we used to call digital solutions. But in a nutshell, think about anything you can sense, anything that you can
Hmm.
monitor. It could be from an integrity standpoint to a vibration standpoint to a temperature standpoint, right? How do you take those data sets now and help your customer deliver something of an outcome, right, that they're looking for as they evolve from the traditional service model to what should be that digital service outcome enablement?
When you were trying to do that, what were the challenges, if any, that you were trying to overcome, be it organizational or technical or process
Yeah,
for that matter, right?
I think there was a ton of learning going on in the, let's call it the non-consumer side of the industrial Internet of Things space, right? So if you think about what IBM was trying to accomplish, what GE was trying to accomplish, what Siemens was trying to accomplish, right? Each of them had their brand names that they were launching
Mhm.
out there. The first path that we were taking was one of, okay, how do we make sure we just get the right data sets, right? So you had these very intelligent data scientists helping us put this together, right? But the algorithms and the training of the models and the curating of those models at that point in time was a starting point, right?
Mm.
There was so much unstructured data and so much isolated island data that putting together the right combination of those to come up with a real algorithm that would deliver an outcome quickly, not to mention at a safe investment upfront cost,
Mhm. Mhm.
those were the biggest challenges, right? And so it's taken almost 10+ years for us to get to where we are today, where all that data has, customers started seeing that, cleaning that data up, master data hierarchy, having the right planning, using the right tools, right? It almost like you had to fix things upstream from a data set standpoint to get to the ability to actually give them some sort of deliverable today.
It's interesting you said what you did because, one of the big realizations I had when we started Entitle is we always made the assumption that customers such as Baker Hughes and the other folks we have in our who have been fortunate we've been fortunate to work with for the last many years would give us clean data. It turns out like 100% of the customers give us not clean data. In some cases, really bad data in terms of quality. In some cases, reasonable data, but it's still a lot of work to get done. Was that like a big revelation for the G Digital slash Baker Hughes folks, or was that something you guys walked into with the eyes wide open?
You know what? I think it completely depends on what the level of maturity of each business that did or did not make the necessary investments upfront. So
Hmm.
if I think about some of the parts of, you think about these large enterprises, right? These large conglomerates, some of them, whether they did it by accident or whether they did it because they had great CTO decision making, they had this data situation cleaned up upfront because they
Mm,
consistently would build, buy, and invest in the, call it, let's say they chose SAP for some reason, from an ERP standpoint, having the right data sets for years in
mm,
advance, right?
mm,
Which allowed you to build a much easier baseline. In other situations where, let's say that the company in question just didn't have the margin to deploy that type of capital to build a well fine-tuned machine of an ERP system, you're going to find yourself in a situation that just isn't going to give you the data necessary, which will then deny you any of those insights you need. And I'd say that maybe there was a third revelation that really came to fruition as we were implementing, even using Entytle, for instance, right? If your go-to-market model was not a direct business-to-business
mhm.
situation, and you decided that channels were the right strategy, which is fine, you lost a lot of that connectivity between point A of sale to where this thing eventually landed, and that
Yeah.
just creates chaos, right? So maybe, I mean, that's going to be a more difficult one to solve for, just because you have to really be thinking about that up front. So a lot of this gave us that credence to think about, okay, there's tons of decisions we should have made upstream that now we know, that now we'll start doing from the get-go. But then now you have to build this whole new data set all over again.
It's interesting what you said. I mean, the whole channel play discussion is fun of the day because it's a very complicated set of legacy choices that people made for the right reasons, and now they're all coming back to bite them because to what you said is most people really can't trace the asset back from the factory to the eventual end user destination. Now, after we met at the digital solutions business, you then went on to lead services for one of the other divisions of Baker Hughes within Europe, actually globally, but based out of Europe.
That's right.
And then you came back to the US to kind of do a sales job. Help me with that. What were the lessons you learned that you took from the North American job to the global job back to a sales job? What was the aftermarket experience like for you in terms of bringing back through all those jobs?
I think it all comes down to maybe two major points, Vivek. One is an obsession with customer experience, right? That really began to be the number one thing that I saw in that North America capacity, because with the increased competition, right, these OEM spaces are getting constantly challenged, right? And the ability to hire, the amount of, we're dealing in a service model, right? So we're dealing with a lot of human beings that we love to deploy, we love to get out there. But as we know over time, there are constraints that are caused, right? Your profitable business machine is going to be asked to how many people do you really need? What's the
Yep.
availability? What's the utilization? So the question starts becoming, all right, how do I preserve an incredible level of customer experience while potentially having to, appropriately or not, deny myself some of this human capital? And how do I replace that with something? What do I replace it with? And that's where that, let's say, take that to the next level, that global role you speak of in Germany, right, for our non-destructive testing business became, okay, so we're not going to be able to hire the thousands of human beings we had before for maybe two reasons. One, there's just less of a pool of people to choose from, and number two, costs, right? So
Hmm.
how do we start thinking about customer experience being digitized? And
Hmm.
how do I start thinking about moving things from, let's say, what your normal things would have been as a service to everything as a service, right? And
Hmm.
event, and I believe that that's where we're going to go, right? At some point, we're all going to have some sort of Netflix model, whether it's for a car, whether it's for an outcome we want to drive on a piece of turbo machinery. And I think that connecting the dots between, okay, regardless of what data we're talking about here, it could be non-destructive testing data, it could be vibration data. How do we now start harnessing that and start
Hmm.
getting able to deliver something remotely, right, with a centralized potential operation to cost, to conserve some of the profitability, to be able to deliver our customers' experience in a
Hmm.
completely different manner.
You've used the phrase customer experience a couple of times now to describe one of the big lessons you learned. You talked about the fact that most industrials either won't have access to or can't hire because of financial reasons the people they need to deliver the experience. I'm going to make a controversial statement or maybe a controversial point of view, which is, we keep hearing about this customer experience stuff from lots of people, but when the rubber meets the road, I've seen that companies tend to default to, well, let's cut costs. because that's the best way to get margin, versus long-term customer experience, which drives retention and lifetime value increase and then margin.
Hmm.
You know, and the controversial question is, you know, are companies, again, you've been around a few companies now, you watch companies from the outside now, are companies really beginning to focus on customer experience, or is it still aspirational in most
I,
places?
I truly believe it's mostly aspirational, Vivek, and maybe there was a second point of learning that really came from the aftermarket side of what we're doing. So one thing is the traditional services, whether they're digital or not, that we're deploying, right? But one additional factor that I think is less aspirational than customer experience, right, is the customer success part of
Mhm.
this, right? So now which is again a cost, right, that we need to live and breathe and understand how we make it profitable by adding these type of human beings who really are there to make sure that the moment that you traditionally were selling, here's your box, Mr. Customer, and I hope things go well,
Mhm.
right? That touch point, that consistency, that ability to get them to interact with your product so that they derive value more quickly. I think that's where the customer experience has to come from first. So there's a broader customer experience desire. I think a lot of our corporations want.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. I lost you for about 30 seconds. Go ahead.
No problem. There's a broader customer experience desire that we have as corporations, but what I think is going to be the inroads to doing that today is, do I have a product that creates value?
Mhm.
Yes, good. So step one. If you can't do that, then this is going to be a much harder game. Number two, assuming I really can get my customer, because of my customer success angle, to click the insight, to click
Mhm.
on the button more often, that's going to be the change agent formula we need to change things, right? To strive a different relationship with that customer. Similar to the way that we obsess about, whether it's an iPhone or a Samsung Galaxy that we have, right? You ask someone if they're willing to part ways with that device today, they'd say they'd rather commit seppuku. So,
Yeah.
I mean, that is the new way we're trying to transform customer experience. And a lot of that is being unlocked by customer success if it's done well.
Mhm. When you think about another point you made along the way about both um, manufacturers as well as customers, end users not having the access to the talent. I remember one of the conversations you and I had a couple of years ago was this whole notion of tech-enabled managed services, right? We were talking in the context of your business, which is, you need a ton of field technicians, you need a lot of people who understand how the customer's operations work, but they're going to be in short supply, both because of attrition reasons and lack of talent pool now. Is this technology investment and services that you guys have been doing, is that also geared towards helping overcome some of that? Or is that a productivity play primarily right now and then eventually a managed service play later on?
Look, I think it's a very real investment that'll continue, especially if I think about what's going on in the energy industry. Interestingly, Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago came out with this fantastic article of just the absolute deficit of petroleum engineers that are going
Mhm.
into the market, right? You
Mhm.
can absolutely parallel that same situation with how many people are studying and getting degrees in any sort of reliability engineering.
Mhm.
There is a concept, I believe, that's coming where a lot of our customers who really more than anything want to make sure that they're delivering yield, throughput, and quality.
Mhm.
So the question is, if that's their core, then all these other capabilities that can be delivered by OEMs with the right digital service model, right? To help them and basically outsource a lot
Mhm.
of those different situations so that they can get the productivity that we need and we'll have the scale to be able to offer that differentiation, right? So I think that this is the evolution that's happening in the market today as customers, and this is normal market tendency, they're going to focus more on
Mhm.
core and they're going to realize that these adjacencies that maybe they built up in the past aren't as necessary for them to control because they can trust that some of these digital services being offered by their suppliers are real, are well executed, and are giving them the insights and therefore the value that they should have been getting.
That's going to be a big shift. And I know some of these things also started happening many years ago. So, I'm a smidge older than you, but I remember when I was running a factory at one of the medical device companies years ago, we used to have a big maintenance department, right? We had motors and pumps and compressors and all kinds of stuff we were kind of maintaining, managing on our own. And that was, I remember we had like a 20 something people maintenance team for this factory that I was working in. I bet you if I go back to the plant today, there's probably no more than a handful of people, and most of them are effectively coordinators of outsourced maintenance service. And I think that's what's probably going to happen in many of the worlds we live in as well today, right? So that's a
Absolutely.
transition that's going to happen. So you did that work at the non-destructive testing business. You ran global services for a while. But then you were brought back in to basically do a sales job, right? You're a North American sales leader or the America sales leader for the Bentley Nevada business again. And so you went from being an M&A guy to being a corporate strategy guy to running services to now being a salesperson. So how did that sales leader? So how did that transition happen? What do you think were the lessons? What do you think of the experiences you gained as a aftermarket and services leader that a prepared you well, and more importantly, in a very direct way, why do you think your management thought that this set of experiences Carlos has is really important to bring into the sales role? What was that thinking like? I mean, if I would ask you to put yourself in their shoes, right?
Absolutely, it's a great question, and honestly, I think it comes down to maybe two major pillars of thought. Right, one was, and I think that the one thing that maybe has the continuity across all these things is, this individual, this Carlos person, has a growth mindset approach to what they're doing, right? So we need someone who can go into whatever this role is. In this case, it was commercial at this time,
Mhm.
right? And we need a combination of performance, right? So let's make sure we run the ship the right way. We all know how much time we spend on managing the quarterly targets that we have as just public entities that sometimes we are, but tied to transformation. There has to be a simultaneous mindset driven by these, not only, I don't even want to call it ever changing.
Mhm.
There is a world here right now, right, Vivek, where I see that these Fortune 100, these Fortune 500 companies, they are at a crossroads of needing to understand how they need to pivot, be that internally and externally, on making sure they don't get left
Mhm.
behind. I mean, we talk a lot about like this concept of, these older dinosaur companies, but the reality is they know they need to change. They know they need to evolve. They want to do it in multiple ways. You can do it through acquisition, but maybe one of the most powerful ways I've seen things change is through the partnership
Mhm.
model, because it allows you to take call it a bite-size investment without having to do a full acquisition, and start bringing in some of the cultural and change management attributes of what these new industries, like what's happening with Industry 4.0, that we have to change, we have to evolve. Our customers, because they've had such a fantastic experience with their iPhone, they want to demand the same from Bentley Nevada. They want to demand the same from Baker. So, the fascinating part of that sales role was, how do I make sure that with great customers, right, with great legacy businesses that we have together with them and great relationships, okay, what's that next step?
Mhm.
What is that CXO level relationship necessary to understand what is the way we're going to take this relationship to a completely different level of engagement with one another? Again, all driven by that desire for them to succeed and create value for them. And I think it was interesting because we were trying a multitude of things, and some things we just recognized that we had it to do with partners, such
Mhm.
as what happened with Augury.
Mhm. When you think about what you just said, I mean, there was a notion of up-leveling the conversation, up-leveling the relationship CXO level versus, maybe just a plant maintenance person, a plant operations manager. Then you also talked about the recognition that there's some gaps in your capabilities that are best filled with partners. You
Mm-hmm,
then took on this role when Baker Hughes announced this investment and partnership with Augury to kind of take them into your install base per se, right?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Uh, there was probably the decision is probably driven by the capability gap, and was the decision also driven by the cultural mindset that maybe a younger, more nimble company brought to Baker Hughes, or was
It,
it?
it absolutely a combination, Vivek. And maybe, if I think about this, hindsight's 2020, of course. I would say that at the most obvious level, the gap in capability for a specific set of, let's say, a specific type of machinery that we deliver for, to make it scalable, to make it faster, value to customer. That absolutely was transparent and, very strategically well placed bet with a company like Augury. I think that the second part of what you're referring to, right? So that cultural change management
Mm-hmm.
transformation piece, there was absolutely a fundamental set of new learnings that we, as a more traditional Fortune 100 company, just absolutely saw
Mm-hmm.
some fantastic use of way of working with the customer, way of structuring the dialogue, so that there was I'd say that maybe a great example of an evolution is a absolutely much more manicured flow of voice of
Mm-hmm.
customer to product management to technology delivery and back again
Mm-hmm.
in an ever evolving cycle, which SaaS allows you to
Mm-hmm.
do, right? Versus your more traditional, look, we need to take 7 years to build a brand new NPI for the specific type of new
Mm-hmm.
turbo machinery, right? That is just absolutely a different model in terms of how to approach your customers. And
There's one thing that I remember when you and I've talked in the recent past about this experience you've had, and you mentioned it a few minutes ago in the example of customer experience. You really embrace the whole notion of customer success, and I've heard that multiple times out of your mouth in terms of customer
yeah,
success for what you're trying to do with this whole thing. Has that experience? Is that Are you bringing that experience back to your parent company, Baker Hughes? Is that beginning to kind of filter back in the company as part of this transition or part of this cultural change, or is that still too early, considering it's been about a year since you started this job, a little over a year?
it's a great question. In fact, we as Bentley Nevada standalone definitely already had customer success management embedded,
Yep.
right? So that, and we took that as an investment we knew we needed. And other parts of our organization, such as now what we're doing with our own Cordon platform, absolutely immediately had CSM capabilities associated with them. So I think it's a known necessity.
Hmm.
The art, however, comes down to, is your delivery vehicle of value structured in such a way that your CSM team can make success out of how you're delivering
Hmm.
that value to the
Hmm.
customer in the easiest way possible,
Hmm.
right? Because sometimes you'll have customer success, but getting the customer to recognize that value is more than a
Hmm.
conversation.
Hmm.
When it becomes a debate, that's when you start losing time.
Right.
You start losing some of that bandwidth. When it's easy for the customer to click a button and recognize, wow, it worked, and that's easy for them to see. It's transparent based on the interface. Let's say there's a dialogue going on in parallel with that CSM agent hand holding that customer. That's where success really happens. That's where magic happens, right? That's where the customer's pleased to expand and go to
Right.
enterprise.
When I think about the words you've been using, you talked about customer experience, you talked about customer success, you talked about capability management, and I'm taking those terms and juxtaposing that with your training as a finance person, right? And I look at some of the experiences I've personally had, and also some of the other guests on the podcast who started as engineers or quality leaders and stuff like that. It's fascinating to see all these different roles wind up in the world of aftermarket and services. Uh, there's a common thread amongst all of you that I've taken away, right? And every time I've talked to people like you and some of the other guests, it's like very clear to me that there's a sense of customer empathy is maybe the right, maybe a
Mm-hmm.
word, but the sense that you will make your customer successful and not regret purchasing from you guys, and services are an important part of the experience. And I think that's one of the common themes I've seen across all of you for that, not just you today. Uh, how do you think that has played that experience and that mindset? How do you think that has played a role in your career today? And do you think that's different because you've had an interesting career as well, looking at lots of different businesses, GE and other places? Do you think that has also evolved in other service leaders? Because in the old days, service was all about wrench turning and break fix and grease monkeys, as we used to call them in the old days. But now I'm listening to all of you, and it's a completely different mindset and words that have come out that I'm seeing coming out of everybody's mouths here. What's that been like?
You know what? So I'll say two things. Maybe number one, and I'm sure that this is what happens with highly successful SaaS businesses as well, outside of what we're trying to achieve together with the Augury Alliance. There is a level of proximity between the supplier and the
Hmm.
customer that turns into a completely different
Hmm.
relationship. You because of their let's say you've delivered the value, because of their satisfaction, right? There is almost an addiction in a good way that's formed between what they now see as the fantastic value you're delivering and their desire for more of it. So it really causes you as the, and I wouldn't call it a supplier as much as a, value provider to them. There is there's a desire for that proximity to close in ever more, right? So it becomes more and more and more of that, what we used to call, and it's a concept that's been around, but it's taken a whole new meaning as that trusted partner that they desire to work with because they know it's going to work. It just makes working with your customer that much easier. So you develop a level of empathy by the nature of just a different relationship that's being formed because of that trust being formed. At the same time, I'll tell you the fact that there's clearly going to be an evolution here of leaders that maybe just, don't bridge that gap to this strong empathy level. But I think that'll be based on, whether or not they're delivering a more traditional service versus a service like the one that can be enabled by artificial intelligence and machine learning.
Yeah, I think there's something you said which is important. There's a transition happening. There's going to be a bunch of people who are going to make it or not. But
Yeah,
the expectations that our end users have based on the technology we'll use in our day-to-day life is what's going to dictate the demands and expectations out of their partners and suppliers as well. I
correct.
think that's going to make a
Yeah,
difference. So I think you're going to start seeing a different kind of aftermarket and service leader who's somebody who's more attuned to this notion of being able to drive value and kind of deliver value and empathy to the customer. So, Carlos, as I try to close this interview, I think there's a couple of questions for you. One is, as you think about the career I've had from finance to M&A and strategy to services leader, commercial leader, now effectively a general manager for another business that the Baker Hughes management has given you to manage to run. That's a very different career path and an opportunity path for service leaders that didn't exist before. Do you think that is it? What let me just say? What kind of advice would you give for people to say, I can be more than just a service leader? Because that was at one time, honestly, that was a dead end job, as in you got there and you never left. But now there are people like you and some of our other guests are moving on to bigger and broader general management roles, right? So, what is that advice you can give people, the younger or the newer generation of service leaders coming in to kind of have a similar career path like you?
uh, that's a great question, Vivek, and maybe I'll answer it two ways, because a part of it is an openness, right, and therefore humility to recognize what you do
Hmm.
not know, right? So, as different skill sets that help you round out your experience, I'll tell you that it is so valuable for a service leader to understand and have been in the shoes of their sales or their commercial or their, call it even, or their
Hmm.
sourcing or their engineering counterparts. Never deny yourself the opportunity to experiment in, and I'm not saying you need to become an
Right.
expert in all these different functions, but it gives you again, maybe this goes back to empathy in a way. It gives you a know-how to how to embrace and maybe listen to and problem solve, putting yourself in the other person's shoes from a functional perspective. Because let's face it, one of the biggest challenges in any interdisciplinary and functional standpoint is the ability to understand where
Yep.
someone's coming from and therefore problem
Yep.
solve together. So I'd say that's number one. Number two, look, I think that and maybe the newer generations have less of this just because they've grown up with, an iPhone and an iPad and a tablet in their hands, but there is still
Hmm.
resistance to new technology. And look, today we're talking about, generic versus fit for purpose AI. Literally, you and I know that several months ago, nobody was talking about large language models and the ability of what generative AI is going to be able to do for the
Yep.
planet. We need to be open to embracing, even if it is a little scary sometimes, right? Because it's something we're not familiar with or something we don't know. I'd say you almost need to go into everything with that growth
Hmm.
mindset openness, right? It's okay to pivot and persevere and fail fast, right? So that you get some of that capability, you get some of that learning. So I'd say those two things, right? One is open mindedness to the training and skill set
Yep. Yep.
building, as well as openness to look, things are going to change even
Yep.
more. right? There's going to be new technologies. We must be constantly have this hunger to learn, read, adapt, right?
The one thing you didn't say again, there's all of you are incredibly high achievers, but also humble. You don't get those chances. You've got to go and try different things or do different jobs if you hadn't delivered and the commitments that was asked of you in the previous jobs, right? So that's the other part is delivering on the
But
commitments, be it financial, customer NPS, or whatever it might be. Those are really the important aspects, right? So not
very
forgetting
true.
that, right?
Yeah.
It's almost like a table
It's
stakes.
funny you say.
Go ahead.
Yeah. It's funny you say that. So, to your point, it's almost like you have to jump to the conclusion that that's the expectation that is
Correct.
ever right. It's almost a question of we don't even
That's
say
right.
that. That's of
That's right.
course part of it. You have to
That's
deliver.
right. You have to deliver. So, as you wrap up this conversation, Carlos, I'm a big fan of podcasts, and one particular podcast I like to listen to is Guy Raz from NPR, and how I built this podcast. And there's a question he always asks
Yes.
people at the end of the podcast, which is when you think of your career and you think of all the success you had so far, how much of it do you ascribe to luck, and how much do you ascribe to Carlos's innate intelligence and drive, and just amazing skills, right?
Yeah. But so look, I'll quote a former mentor, coach, and manager, boss, leader of mine that I absolutely appreciate a lot of the wisdom that he imparted on me. And he would ask me the question, "What's better, to be lucky or to be good?" And I'd pause and pick one of the two. I can't remember which one I chose, and the answer
Yep.
is both. Unfortunately, whether we like it
Yep.
or not, things such as timing, things such as what's happening macroeconomically, right? Such as when we even enter the
Yep.
workforce during a recession or during a positive
Hmm.
macroeconomic situation, it changes a lot
Totally.
of things, right? Some things are in our control, some things are not. I'd say that as long as you approach problems and you approach your life with one, again, back to growth mindset, but two, that humility and desire to always be
Mhm.
learning, right? That will dramatically change the way that you approach anything, be that a new job, be that a career, be that your family, right? So I'd say that all ties together, and there's going to be performance and you need to have it. Sometimes there's a lot given to luck and
Perfect.
timing.
That's exactly the way I think about stuff as well. So, Carlos, this has been a fantastic conversation. As always, nuggets of wisdom about customer experience, customer success, results, the transitions that we're going to see in the workforce. This has been a great 30-minute conversation with you. I really, really appreciate it. With that, folks, we'll be off to the next episode in a few days. Carlos, thank you very much for taking the time today. I know you're busy traveling all over the world trying to get things going. So I appreciate the time you spent with us today. Thank you, Carlos.
No, thank you. Thank you for the invitation, Vivek.
Appreciate it.
It's been a
Thank
pleasure.
you.